The beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality. Tubes snaked from my arms, and a dull ache spread across my chest with every breath. The sterile smell of disinfectant clung to the air, cold and impersonal. I had just made it through a major surgery. 6 hours on the table, 12 in recovery. The surgeon said I was lucky to be alive. But as I blinked up at the dim ceiling of my hospital room, the real pain had nothing to do with the stitches or the medications. It was the silence, the emptiness. No one had come. Not my son, not my daughter, not even my sister, who I used to speak to every single day. My phone remained untouched on the bedside table, the screen dark. Not a single call, not a single message, nothing. They knew I was here. I had made sure of it. I'd left voicemails, sent texts before the surgery, even gave them the hospital room number. I was scared, I'll admit it. Scared I wouldn't make it, scared to be alone. And yet, alone was exactly how they left me. I waited. 1 day, 2. A week passed. Nurses came and went with polite, professional smiles, but no familiar faces ever walked through that door. Not a flower, not a card, not even a hope you're okay. By the time I was discharged, my chest ached more from the abandonment than the sutures. When I finally got home, struggling to climb the stairs with my walker, there was a stack of unopened mail on my kitchen table. My house was untouched, as though my absence hadn't mattered in the slightest. I collapsed into the living room chair and let the tears fall. I had always been the caretaker, the matriarch, the one who showed up. Birthdays, graduations, even minor breakups. I was there with food, support, and unconditional love. But when it was my turn to need someone, they couldn't be bothered. A few weeks later, I sat across from my lawyer, going over the revisions to my will. He looked at me, hesitating before he spoke. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, voice cold as steel. Because that's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always come with shouting matches or slammed doors. Sometimes it's just absence. A phone that never rings. A hospital room that stays empty. But the real punch in the gut. 2 months later, I watched all 3 of them, my son, my daughter, my sister, file into the law office dressed in black, faces pulled into expressions of faux grief. I wasn't even cold in the ground yet, and they were already licking their lips, waiting to hear what I'd left them. The same people who couldn't find a moment to visit me when I was hanging on by a thread suddenly had all the time in the world to sit through a will reading. But oh, I had planned for this. They thought they knew me. They thought I was still the same old pushover, soft-hearted, forgiving, always giving, never asking for anything in return. They were wrong. Dead wrong. I watched their faces change, smiles fading, expressions tightening as the lawyer began to read. Page after page, detail after detail, it unfolded exactly as I had intended. And that, dear reader, is where this story truly begins. You see, betrayal is a quiet kind of death. But revenge is loud. I didn't grow up with much. My parents were factory workers who taught me the value of hard work, sacrifice, and, most of all, family. So when I had my own children, I swore I'd give them everything I never had. And I did. I worked 2 jobs for most of their childhoods, packed lunches with little handwritten notes, showed up for every school play, every parent-teacher conference, even when I had to rush over in scrubs and sore feet. When my sister Marlene's husband left her and she had nowhere to go, I didn't hesitate. I opened up my home. She lived with us for 2 years, rent-free, until she got back on her feet. I lent her money, supported her business, and stood by her side through every breakdown. But the thing about giving people everything is that they start to expect it. Worse, they start to feel entitled to it. My generosity became their baseline. And somewhere along the line, I stopped being a person to them and started being a resource. It started subtly, the way most betrayals do. Missed birthdays. Forgotten calls. My texts started getting one-word replies, or worse, silence. My son Jeremy used to call me every Sunday, like clockwork. After he got that big promotion and moved into the city, the calls slowed to once a month. Then once every few months. Then never. My daughter Elise fared no better. She only ever called when she needed something: babysitting, money for a down payment, help covering a surprise bill. I never said no, even when I wanted to, especially when I couldn't afford to. And Marlene? After she moved out and her business took off, she didn't need me anymore. At least not until she wanted help with the down payment on her new condo. I wrote the check, $10,000, with no contract, no expectation. Just trust. But trust, I've learned, is a dangerous currency. When I collapsed in my kitchen last year, dizzy, breathless, clutching my chest, I thought I was dying. Turns out I was halfway there. A heart condition I never knew I had. Emergency. Surgery. 6 nights in the hospital. And not one of them came. Not even after I got home. Not even when I called. "Oh, I was just so busy, Mom," Elise had said afterward. "You know how things are with the kids." Jeremy texted me 2 weeks later. "Glad you're okay. We'll catch up soon." Marlene didn't even bother with an excuse. And that's when it hit me. Something hard, something bitter. They didn't care. Not really. Not about me. Only about what I could do for them. I was disposable. Replaceable. Forgettable. The only time I saw them again, all together, was at my home, when they caught wind that my health was declining and assumed, like vultures, circling, that the end was near. They started making polite conversation, pretending to care. Elise even brought flowers. Jeremy offered to help with errands, and Marlene smiled too wide. They thought I didn't notice. They thought I was still weak, still desperate for their attention. But I wasn't. I had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong. Too many afternoons crying into the same hands that had once held theirs. I had worn myself out trying to be good enough, loving enough, useful enough. Until I realized something crucial. They weren't the problem. I was. I had taught them how to treat me. I had allowed it. And now, I was the only one who could unteach them. So, while they waited for me to crumble, I was busy putting something else together. Something stronger. Something final. And when it was done, I folded the pages carefully, sealed the envelope, and placed it in the lawyer's hands. "If they want a piece of me," I told him, "they're going to have to listen to every word." This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. It wasn't about a missed phone, call, or forgotten visit. It was about something far deeper, more dangerous. It was about the erosion of everything I had built, my family, my legacy, my very sense of worth. See, people think betrayal is a single moment, a knife in the back, a loud argument, a dramatic walkout. But that's not how it works. Not really. Betrayal is quiet. It's incremental. It starts with one moment of silence, then another, until you're screaming inside and no one even notices. They didn't just abandon me emotionally. They stripped me of dignity. As I recovered from surgery, I realized how vulnerable I truly was. I needed help. Real help. Groceries, rides to appointments, someone to sit beside me when the nights got too long and the fear too loud. And where were they? Gone. Too busy. Too tired. Too distracted. But not too busy to post selfies at brunch. Not too tired to attend parties or vacations. Marlene went on a Caribbean cruise 2 days after I got home from the hospital. Elise hosted a wine night with her friends. The same weekend, I had a post-op scare and spent 12 hours in the ER, alone. And Jeremy, he was in Italy. I saw it on Instagram. A full album of sun-drenched villas and cocktails beside infinity pools, all captioned with things like, "Grateful for this beautiful life." Not once did he message me while I was recovering. What did all of this mean? It meant I had poured decades of my life into people who never planned to pour anything back. It meant that when the day finally came that I couldn't take care of myself, I had no one to rely on. Not really. It meant that everything I had worked so hard for, every dollar saved, every sacrifice made, was at risk of ending up in the hands of people who didn't love me. Not truly. Not in the ways that matter. You don't realize how much you've been carrying until you fall, and no one offers to pick you up. And I had carried them all. Their debts, their emotions, their problems. I had excused bad behavior under the guise of family loyalty. I had stayed silent when they dismissed me, disrespected me, discarded me. I told myself it would change, that they would grow up, that I had to be patient. But patience is no substitute for respect. And love, without respect, that's just manipulation dressed up in pretty words. There's something shattering about seeing your own blood, your own flesh, look right through you like you're furniture in a room they've outgrown. And worse still, watching them circle like hyenas, sniffing for what's theirs the moment. They think your time is up. That will reading. Oh, I knew they'd come. I knew the second I closed my eyes for good, they'd crawl out of their holes and dust off their fake tears. Because if there's one thing they cared about more than me, it was money. They assumed they'd get it all. They assumed I hadn't changed a thing. They assumed wrong. You see, it wasn't about revenge for the sake of being petty. This was about justice. It was about ensuring that my legacy, the life I worked for, bled for, wouldn't become their next entitlement. I didn't want my hard-earned estate to fund Jeremy's third luxury car, or Elise's overpriced yoga retreats, or Marlene's next flashy renovation. I wanted it to mean something. I wanted it to go to the people who were there. The nurse, who held my hand during the worst of the pain. The neighbor who brought groceries every week without being asked. The charity that gave free rides to medical appointments when no one else would. They deserved it. Not because of blood, because of loyalty, because of love, because they showed up. And that's what this story is really about. Not revenge for the sake of vengeance, but karma served cold, in silence, with receipts. They thought I'd die quietly. They thought they'd win by default. But they forgot one very important thing. I always finish what I start. I didn't get angry. Not in the way they expected. There were no screaming voicemails, no dramatic ultimatums. Just silence, just distance. While they carried on with their lives, blissfully unaware, I was making quiet moves in the background. It started with my will. I'd had one in place for years, basic, traditional, the kind you make when you assume your children will grow into decent adults. Everything split evenly, house, savings, investments. It was simple. Too simple. But now, it needed teeth. My lawyer, Mr. Ridley, had been handling my affairs for nearly a decade. A cautious man, always by the book, but even he raised his eyebrows when I showed him the new distribution. "You're sure about this?" he asked, tapping the edge of the legal pad. "Absolutely." We went over every detail. I removed Jeremy, Elise, and Marlene from the primary asset list. Instead, I left small, symbolic amounts. Amounts that would make a point, not a profit. Jeremy would get the old recliner in the basement, the one he always said was an eyesore I should throw away. Along with it, a $1 and a letter. Elise would receive my worn-out recipe box. She used to complain about how my cooking was too old-fashioned, so I figured it was poetic. Marlene would inherit a framed photo of us from when she first moved in with me, taken before things soured. A reminder, not a reward. But the real plan, the part that made me smile as I recovered in silence, was what I did with the rest. I set up a scholarship fund in my name at the local community college, dedicated to single mothers returning to school. I left a significant amount to the nurse, Angela, who sat with me during my darkest nights in the hospital and treated me like a human being, not just a chart. I donated a portion to Meals on Wheels, the very organization that showed up when my own family didn't. I wrote them a letter too, explaining why it mattered. And the house? That went to my neighbor Sam, a widower in his 60s, who shoveled my driveway after the snowstorm, brought soup when I couldn't get out of bed, and never asked for a thing in return. But I didn't stop there. Rewriting a will is one thing. But I wanted them to hear it. I wanted them to sit in that room, expecting a payout, wearing those practiced expressions of grief, and be served with truth instead. So, I recorded a message, Nothing flashy. Just me, sitting in my living room, calm and collected. "I know why you're here," I began, looking directly into the camera. "You weren't here when it mattered, but you're here now. You came for what you thought you were owed. Let me explain why you're leaving empty-handed." I went on to list the moments they failed, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. I talked about the silence, the absence, the way they made me feel like a burden when I needed help the most. I ended the video with a smile. I hope this serves as a reminder that people remember how you treat them when they're at their lowest. That's when character shows. And if you're watching this, well, yours did. Mr. Ridley agreed to play the video during the official reading. And just to ensure there were no legal loopholes, I attached everything with an airtight no contest clause. If they challenged it in court, they'd forfeit even the symbolic scraps. I left nothing to chance. Because this wasn't about being vindictive. It was about taking control. About leaving behind something that actually mattered. Something honest. Something intentional. They had taken for granted the woman I used to be. The giver. The fixer. The quiet one. But the woman they overlooked in that hospital bed, she was gone. And the one who replaced her? She was ready. There's a quiet power in planning while others underestimate you. While they went on with their lives, making assumptions, I moved like a shadow, carefully, deliberately, and always a step ahead. I started by documenting everything. Not just legal paperwork, but personal receipts too. The unanswered texts. The ignored calls. The dates and times I reached out. I printed copies and kept a journal. Not out of pettiness, but clarity. Because memory fades, but paper doesn't lie. Then I requested my full hospital records. Every surgery note, every post-op follow-up, even the admission log from the emergency room. It sounds excessive, maybe, but I wanted a clear, undeniable picture of just how serious my condition had been. I wanted to remember, not just for them, but for me. Proof that I hadn't imagined the silence, that it really was as bad as I remembered. I reviewed my finances next, line by line. I traced every loan I'd ever given Marlene, every transfer I'd sent to Elise, every short-term deposit into Jeremy's business that somehow never came back. I wrote it all down, with dates, amounts, and descriptions. Decades of quiet, giving, laid bare in black and white. Once I had it all, I met with Mr. Ridley again. We drafted airtight clauses, no wiggle room, no he said, she said. If any of them tried to contest the will, they'd receive nothing. If they tried to challenge the trusts, the funds would be redirected to backup charities. I wasn't going to let them bully their way into anything. I also made sure the real beneficiaries knew what was coming. I invited Angela, the nurse, for coffee one afternoon. She cried when I told her. "No one's ever done something like this for me," she said. "You did something for me," I told her. "You showed up." Same with Sam, my neighbor. I handed him a sealed envelope with instructions for Mr. Ridley. He tried to refuse it. I didn't do any of that expecting. "I know," I said. "That's why you're getting it." I made a spreadsheet, a file folder, a backup folder. I wasn't taking any chances. And then, finally, I turned to my children and sister. Not directly, but digitally. I changed the locks to the house. I updated my power of attorney. I removed them from my emergency contact list at the hospital. I took control back, piece by piece. The final step was setting the date for the will reading. Mr. Ridley scheduled it for the week following my funeral. Invitations were sent. Formal, elegant, with their names printed in gold lettering. No one refused. They were curious, eager, maybe even smug. I imagine they told themselves it was guilt that brought them back, that they'd come to honor my memory. But deep down, I think they knew. I think some part of them felt the shift, like the air had changed and they were no longer in control. That's the thing about people who manipulate with silence. They never expect the quiet ones to strike back, but I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for closure. I wasn't going to yell or argue. I wasn't going to try to make them understand. Because they wouldn't. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered. What I wanted, what I planned, was to show them the cost of their absence, to make them sit with it, hear it, feel it. That's what justice looks like sometimes. Not in grand gestures, but in uncomfortable silences and truths spoken plainly. The pieces were in place. The records documented. The beneficiaries secured. The video cued. Everything was ready. And when they walked into that room expecting a payday, what they got was something else entirely. A reckoning. The conference room was quiet. Too quiet. Jeremy sat near the window, legs crossed, dressed like he'd just come from some executive boardroom. Elise wore black like it was a costume. Marlene arrived last, reeking of too much perfume and entitlement. None of them looked particularly sad. A few forced sighs. Elise dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue that stayed suspiciously dry. They weren't mourning. They were waiting. Mr. Ridley stood at the head of the long mahogany table, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Before I proceed with the formal reading, there's something your sister, requested you watch." He pressed play. The screen on the wall flickered to life. There I was, sitting in my favorite armchair, calm and collected. I wore a navy sweater, pearls around my neck. My hands were folded neatly in my lap. "I know why you're here," I said, looking directly into the camera. "You came for what you think you're owed. But let me explain something. Inheritance isn't about obligation. It's about intention. And I no longer intend to reward absence." Jeremy shifted in his seat. I continued. "You weren't there when I needed you. You weren't there in the hospital. You weren't there when I came home. You weren't even there when I called. I gave everything I had to this family, my time, my money, my love. And when I needed just a fraction of that in return, silence." Elise looked down. Marlene's jaw clenched. "I want you to know that I didn't make these decisions out of anger," I said. "I made them out of clarity. This isn't punishment, it's recognition. The people who will benefit from my estate are the ones who showed up, the ones who gave, even when they didn't have to, the ones who didn't ask what I could do for them, but asked how I was doing. They're the ones carrying my legacy forward." The screen went black. Silence. Then Mr. Ridley began reading the will aloud. "To my son Jeremy, I leave the leather recliner in the basement and $1. May it remind you of everything you ignored while chasing more." Jeremy's face flushed. "What the hell is this?" "To my daughter Elise, I leave my recipe box, the one you always found so outdated. May it teach you that love is often found in the little things you once dismissed." Elise's lip trembled, but she said nothing. "To my sister Marlene, I leave the photo of us during better times. May it serve as a mirror, not a memory." Marlene stood up. "Is this a joke? You can't be serious." "Oh, I assure you," Ridley said calmly. "She was very serious." He continued, detailing the full extent of the new will. The scholarship fund, the donation to Meals on Wheels, the full ownership of the house going to Sam, the cash sum and investment account gifted to Angela, all with names, documents, and sealed letters of thanks. "You've got to be kidding me," Jeremy muttered. "She's giving it all to strangers?" Mr. Ridley looked at him, unblinking. "No. She gave it to the people who were family in action, even if not in blood." And then came the final clause. Should any of the original heirs contest, their share will be forfeited in full and immediately redistributed to secondary beneficiaries. Jeremy opened his mouth, then closed it. Marlene swore under her breath and stormed out. Elise sat quietly, eyes glistening, but with guilt or regret, I'll never know. And just like that, it was done. Everything I had feared, that they'd walk all over me even after I was gone, never came to pass. Instead, I got the last word. Not in anger, not in rage, but in truth. That's the power of closure. It doesn't always come in dramatic confrontations or screaming matches. Sometimes it comes in calm declarations and decisions made with a clear mind and a steady hand. My story didn't end with heartbreak. It ended with justice, with love rewarded, with absence exposed. And as they walked away empty-handed, perhaps, for the first time, they were forced to see me, not as a wallet or a fallback plan, but as a person, a woman who gave, and then finally stopped.
That was new. Grace. I also made a point to call old friends I'd drifted from, women who once laughed with me late into the night before I stopped reaching out, too ashamed to admit that my life wasn't picture perfect. To my surprise, they welcomed me back without question. We met for lunch, for long walks, for nothing in particular. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, even if I'd been living like I was. The hardest part was the moments when Emily would ask, "Is Daddy coming back?" or "Why don't you eat dinner with him anymore?" I never lied, but I also never poisoned the well. I told her gently that grown-ups sometimes hurt each other in ways they shouldn't, and that what mattered most was that she was safe, loved, and never, ever to blame. Each time I answered her, I felt myself becoming more grounded, more rooted in the kind of woman and mother I wanted to be. One afternoon, after school pickup, Emily looked at me from the back seat and said, "You laugh more now." I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Do I?" She nodded. "You were sad for a long time before. I like this version of you." I cried in the driveway after that. Happy tears, healing tears, because I knew she saw me. The real me. Reclaiming myself wasn't loud or dramatic. It was in the choices I made each day. Choosing what music played in the kitchen. Choosing solitude over staying in touch with toxic relatives, who only ever called to gossip. Choosing to look in the mirror and see not someone who had been left, but someone who had walked away from what no longer served her. I was still in the thick of it. Some nights were lonelier than others. Some mornings, I woke up and missed the shape of another body beside me. But I never once missed him. Not anymore. Because the woman I was becoming? She was learning how to fill her own spaces. And she was, finally starting to shine. It started with a folder on my laptop titled, "What If?" I didn't tell anyone about it. It was just for me. A private little world where I let my curiosity speak louder than my fear. Inside it, I began saving job listings. Not just the safe ones I was technically qualified for, but the bold ones. The roles that made my heart race a little. Editorial assistant at a lifestyle magazine. Program coordinator for a nonprofit that supported single mothers. Community outreach work for an arts initiative. I didn't know what exactly I was looking for. I only knew I'd outgrown the version of myself that stayed put just because it was easier. After a decade of teaching, I was good at routines, lesson plans, keeping things under control. But control had become a cage. I wanted to do something. That made me feel alive again. So I emailed a former student who now worked at a local nonprofit and asked to grab coffee. It felt ridiculous at first, me, the woman who used to correct her grammar, now asking her for advice. But she was kind, encouraging. She told me I had something valuable most people didn't. Life experience, emotional intelligence, and the ability to listen. "You have a way of making people feel seen," she said. I'd forgotten that about myself. That weekend, I updated my resume for the first time in years. It wasn't just a list of roles and tasks. It was a quiet retelling of a woman who had lived, adapted, and evolved. Then I hit send on an application. Just one. But it felt like I'd lit a match in a long, dark room. At the same time, I started carving out small rituals that were just for me. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, a new recipe every Friday night, a walk before sunset without my phone, just the hush of evening and the sound of my own thoughts. I wasn't reinventing myself overnight, but I was slowly building a life that felt intentionally mine. I also began journaling each night, not a recap of the day, but a check-in. Did I honor myself today? Did I speak with kindness to the woman in the mirror? What do I need tomorrow to feel more grounded? Some nights, The answers came easily. Other times, they didn't. But the act of asking, the act of noticing, was enough. Emily was thriving, too. She seemed lighter, freer, like she'd stopped holding her breath waiting for the storm. We had dance parties in the kitchen, made blanket forts on the weekends, and baked cookies that usually ended up burnt but full of laughter. One night, she handed me a crayon drawing she made at school. It was of our house, just the two of us. Above the roof, she'd written, "Home is where Mom is." I pinned it on the fridge, and something inside me settled. This wasn't just rebuilding, it was rewriting. There were still hurdles, the lawyer meetings, the paperwork, the polite but cold drop-offs with Ben. But none of that took me under anymore. I had anchor points now, small joys, new dreams, and the unshakable truth that I had survived the hardest part. The woman who once stayed silent to keep the peace was now speaking up. The woman who tiptoed around someone else's moods was now choosing people and jobs and spaces that didn't require shrinking. The woman who once wondered, "Is this all there is?" was discovering, no, there's more. There's always more. Not because of a man, not because of a perfect plan, but because she decided to begin again. The email came on a Tuesday morning, buried between a coupon for kids' shoes and a school district notice about early release. Subject, follow-up from AWA, Community Outreach Coordinator position. I almost deleted it by mistake. My heart jumped when I saw the name, Angela Whitaker Arts, the nonprofit I'd applied to weeks ago and heard nothing from. I'd told myself they'd already moved on, that I wasn't what they were looking for. That maybe the world didn't make space for 38-year-old single mothers looking for a second chance. But the email was brief, warm, direct. They wanted to meet. That Thursday, I walked into their downtown office with hands that trembled only slightly. It was an old repurposed firehouse, with art on the brick walls and mismatched chairs that made it feel more like a living room than a workplace. I sat across from a woman named Kendra, their program director. She was sharp, intuitive. She didn't waste time with standard interview questions. Instead, she asked, "What made you apply? Really?" And I told her the truth. "I forgot who I was for a while," I said. "I spent years putting myself last. I thought that was what love was. But when everything fell apart, I realized the only way forward was to remember what made me feel again. And giving back, making people feel seen, that's always been at the core of who I am." She didn't blink, just nodded. "We need more women like that here." By the time I left the building, they'd offered me a part-time trial position with full potential to expand. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was modest, but it was mine, not handed to me, not because of who I used to be, because of who I'd become. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Emily eating spaghetti and coloring together while I told her. "Does this mean you're going to have a job where you help people?" she asked, eyes wide. "Yes, baby. I think so." She grinned. "That's cool. You're like a superhero, but with paper and meetings." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. But the surprises didn't stop there. The following weekend, I took Emily to an art fair downtown. We walked past tents filled with handmade pottery, live musicians, and watercolor prints. She begged to get her face painted. I said yes without hesitation. While she sat getting transformed into a glittery blue butterfly, a man at the next booth smiled at me. "You've got a great laugh," he said. I blinked. "Oh, thank you." He held out a card. "I run community workshops through the public library. Saw you checking out the booth. I teach weekend classes, creative journaling, storytelling stuff. If you're ever interested in co-hosting or just showing up, let me know." I took the card, not sure what to say. My stomach fluttered, not in the nervous way I used to feel with Ben, but in the way you feel when the world is opening. I didn't call him. Not yet, but I kept the card. Because maybe the next chapter didn't have to be about rebuilding what was lost. Maybe it was about discovering what was waiting. Over the next few weeks, I began settling into my new role, helping plan local events, connecting with under-resourced families, creating programs that brought art into overlooked spaces. I was still learning, fumbling, figuring it out. But I went to bed each night, feeling right, whole, like I was finally standing in a life that wasn't held together by fear or obligation, but by choice. And the more I leaned into it, the more doors seemed to open. Not big, dramatic ones, but smaller ones. Ones that whispered, "You're allowed to want more. You're allowed to have joy. You're allowed to start again." It started with the calendar. Ben still hadn't adjusted to the fact that my life no longer revolved around his schedule. He'd text at the last minute, asking if he could take Emily out for dinner, or push back pickup because something came up at work. For months, I'd accommodated, out of habit, out of guilt, out of some hollow sense of politeness. But one Tuesday evening, after he canceled yet another weekend plan with her, something in me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I sat down at my desk, pulled up a shared Google Calendar, and typed, "Parenting schedule, final." Color-coded. Structured. Firm. With a note at the top, "Any changes require 48-hour notice unless it's an emergency. Thank you." The next day, Ben texted, "What's this about? We've always been flexible." I replied, "That flexibility was costing Emily stability and costing me peace. This is how we move forward." He didn't like it. I could tell. He didn't reply for 2 hours, which used to unravel me. Now, I closed the thread and moved on with my day. That same week, I started saying no to other things too. A friend from the couple's dinner group asked if I'd like to meet for lunch. It was the kind of friend who'd always laugh too hard at Ben's jokes, who once told me, "You're lucky. Ben's just a guy, you know. All men slip up. Be grateful he's still around." I used to pretend not to hear the blade in her compliments. But this time, I wrote back, "Thanks for the invite, but I'm being intentional about surrounding myself with people who respect what I've been through. I need support, not judgment." She never responded, and I didn't miss her. It wasn't just others I had to draw lines with. It was myself. The part of me that apologized for everything. The voice that said, maybe I overreacted. The habit of assuming I needed to make everyone else comfortable before I could breathe. I started catching her mid-sentence. "I'm sorry, but..." "No." Rephrase. "Actually, I'd prefer not to." At work, I stopped shrinking in meetings. I'd suggest ideas without prefacing them with, "This might sound silly, but..." I watched the way people listened when I spoke like I believed I had something to say. Because I did. One night, Ben called, not to talk about Emily, but about himself. He was struggling, he said. The woman he'd been seeing had moved on. He was lonely. He missed the way I used to hold everything together. I listened. Quietly. Then I said, "Ben, I'm not your soft place to land anymore. You gave that up when you chose her over this family. I'll always be Emily's mother, but I am not your emotional caretaker." Silence. Then, "You don't have to be so cold, Sarah." "No," I said, calm as the ocean before dawn. "I'm just clear." It was the first time I truly understood the difference. Boundaries weren't about punishment or walls, they were choices, loving choices, for myself, for my daughter. For a future that didn't carry the weight of what I'd survived. I began teaching Emily about them too. When a classmate started calling her names at school, I didn't just say, "Ignore him." I said, "You have the right to speak up." To say, "That's not okay." To walk away. You get to decide what you'll allow in your life. She looked up at me, wide-eyed, and whispered, "Like you do with Daddy now?" I nodded. Exactly like that. She smiled. And it wasn't just pride I saw in her face. It was permission. Permission to be whole. Permission to choose peace over pleasing. Permission to take up space and know she was worth the boundaries she set. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the hollow silence of loneliness, the kind I used to dread when Ben left the house and I didn't know where he was. No, this was different. It was stillness, peaceful, like the calm breath right before a song begins. Emily was with Ben for the weekend, and for the first time in months, I didn't fill the time with errands or chores. I didn't overbook myself or sit waiting for his schedule to shift again. I just Let the space be. That Saturday morning, I wandered into a small indie bookstore that had opened on the edge of town. It was called Dog-Eared and Loved, and the woman behind the counter greeted me like she already knew I was coming. There was no urgency, no lists. I picked up a used poetry collection by Mary Oliver and sat in the corner by the window, flipping through verses that made something inside me ache, in the best way. One line stuck to me like glue. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? It was the first time I felt like I had an answer that didn't include someone else's expectations. Later that day, I took myself to lunch, alone. Sat by the window of a cafe and ordered exactly what I wanted, no compromise. I brought a journal and wrote down 5 things I'd always wanted to try but never had the courage to pursue. A watercolor class, 2, volunteering at an animal shelter, hiking solo for singing in public. Traveling, alone, just once, even if just to the next town over. It wasn't about doing them all at once, it was about remembering I could. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, lit a candle, and turned on the playlist I used to dance to in college. Songs I hadn't heard in years. I danced in my kitchen in bare feet, twirling like the woman I used to be before life made me quieter. For a moment, I wasn't a mother, or an ex-wife, or a woman recovering from betrayal. I was just Sarah. And that was enough. The following week at work, Kendra asked if I'd consider co-leading a workshop on storytelling for survivors of emotional trauma. I've seen the way people respond to you, she said. You speak from the scar, not the wound, and people feel safe in that. I hesitated at first. I wasn't sure I was ready. But then I remembered the card I'd tucked into my drawer, the one from the art fair, from the man who ran journaling workshops. I reached out. His name was Julian. He remembered me. We met for coffee to talk logistics, but ended up talking about books, our kids, and the ridiculous way time speeds up when you're finally healing. He never flirted, never pressed, but his kindness settled around me like a warm coat on a cold day. Not fire, not urgency, just ease. I wasn't sure where it would go, and for the first time, I didn't need to know. The joy wasn't in the outcome. It was in allowing possibility. At home, Emily and I started a new tradition. Our Sunday mornings became adventure time. Sometimes we'd bake pancakes and wear silly hats. Sometimes we'd go explore a new park or make up stories about strangers we passed. We laughed more. She started sleeping better. She stopped asking why Daddy didn't stay. She started asking, where are we going next? And I always answered, somewhere good. Because I wasn't just rebuilding a life. I was rediscovering joy, not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet, honest kind that seeps into your bones, that shows up in belly laughs and deep sleep and sunrises that make you pause mid-step. I wasn't healed all the way. Some days still stung, but I was living. And for the first time in a long time, I liked the woman I was becoming. I didn't intend to write the letter. It began as a journal entry, just a way to ground myself after a long day. Emily had gone to bed early, the house was quiet, and that familiar ache crept in. Not sadness. Exactly, but memory. A remembering of who I had been before everything unraveled. Without thinking, I wrote at the top of the page, Dear me, then paused. What would I even say to that woman? The one who once stood by the front window, arms folded tight across her chest, watching the clock tick long past the time he said he'd be back. The one who double-checked phone records and sniffed his shirt and fought to smile at family dinners, while dying inside. The one who apologized before speaking, who shrank herself to make space for someone who only took and never returned. What could I offer her now that she hadn't already bled trying to find? I took a breath, then wrote, Dear me, you won't believe how strong you are. Right now, I know you feel like you're breaking, like the life you built was made of glass and someone dropped it without warning. You're trying to gather the pieces, cutting your fingers as you go. Trying to hold it together for your daughter, for the neighbors, for everyone but yourself. Stop. It's okay to fall apart. I promise you won't stay broken. This pain, it will pass. It will transform you, but it will not define you. The you are things you think you'll never survive? You will. You'll confront him. You'll say the words you thought you never could. And you'll walk away with your spine straighter than ever before. You'll cry, yes, but those tears won't be weakness. They'll be cleansing. You'll learn to let go of guilt that never belonged to you. You'll stop asking what you did wrong and start asking what you need. You'll rediscover laughter, in small moments at first. Pancakes with Emily, a book that feels like an old friend, a sunset that makes you stop mid-step. And later, in bigger ways, music, movement, adventure, you'll dance again. You'll meet people who see you, not the version of you that bends and breaks for others, but the real you. You'll realize you don't need anyone else's permission to be whole. And you'll forgive yourself. That's the hardest part. But you will. You'll look back at your reflection one day and say, she didn't fail. She survived. She loved deeply. And when it was time, she let go. I want you to know, nothing was wasted. Not the years, not the tears, not the nights you prayed for change. They all brought you here. To a place where your peace is no longer up for negotiation. You'll learn that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors you choose to open or close. You'll teach your daughter that her worth isn't measured by how much of herself she gives away. And love, it will look different now. Not fireworks or frantic apologies, but calm, steady. Someone who sees the scars and stays anyway, or maybe no one at all for a while. And that will be enough, because you will be enough. So if you're reading this on one of the hard nights, let this be your anchor. You make it. You heal. You rise. And somewhere, not far from now, a version of you is laughing in the kitchen, barefoot and free, whispering, "Thank you," to the woman who didn't give up. Keep going. You are so much more than what he left behind. With love and awe, Sarah. When I finished, I sat back in my chair, tears slipping down my cheeks, but not from sadness, from release. I folded the letter and tucked it into my nightstand, not because I needed to read it again, but because someday Emily might, and I wanted her to know exactly who her mother had become. The envelope was simple, cream-colored with a gold wax seal. It had been tucked into my mailbox between a credit card offer and a dental appointment reminder, and I almost missed it. Inside was a single card with elegant calligraphy. You are cordially invited to speak at the Women's Renewal Circle, a gathering of stories, strength, and second chances. Below it, the name of the bookstore, dog-eared and loved, and a date just 3 weeks away. At first, I laughed aloud. There had to be a mistake. I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't a life coach. I wasn't anyone extraordinary. I was a woman who had been cheated on, broken down, and clawed her way back with more dignity than direction. But then, I saw the note at the bottom. Sarah, we'd be honored if you'd share your story. You've inspired more people than you know. Jules. Julian, the journaling workshop guy. We'd shared coffee and stories and quiet glances, and in the weeks since, we'd started texting regularly. There had been no labels, no declarations, just an easy, honest rhythm between us that felt safe. I stared at the invitation for a long time. Part of me wanted to say no, hide, keep the new Sarah quietly growing in the shadows. But another part, the louder, bolder part, felt something stir. I had spent years biting my tongue, swallowing truths, dimming myself to keep the peace. Maybe it was time I stopped. The night of the event, I almost backed out. I stood in front of the mirror in a navy blue dress. Simple, soft, chosen because it made me feel beautiful, not because anyone else had approved of it. My hands shook as I pinned back my hair. My throat tightened when I thought about the women who'd be there. Strangers, survivors, maybe even versions of my younger self. What if I stumble? What if I cry? What if my voice cracks and they see the part of me that's still healing? But then I remembered. That was the point. This wasn't about performance. It was about truth. The bookstore was packed. Folding chairs lined every corner, fairy lights strung along shelves of worn novels. The scent of chamomile tea and old paper filled the air. I spotted Kendra in the front row. Julian stood near the back, his eyes warm, giving nothing but encouragement. Stepped onto the small wooden platform and took a breath. And I told my story, not the polished version, the real one. I spoke of the day Ben went out for a jog and didn't come back until after dark, of how I knew, of the confrontation, the disbelief, the unraveling. I shared the nights I couldn't sleep, the days I wore smiles like armor, the way I stopped recognizing myself in mirrors. I spoke of Emily, of her questions, her resilience, her Sunday adventures with a mother learning to laugh again. And then I shared what came next. The bookstore, the journal, the letter, the quiet rediscovery of joy. I told them how healing didn't happen all at once, that some days still caught me off guard, but that didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was human. When I finished, the room was still. And then someone clapped. Then another. And another. Soon the room was echoing with applause, not for perfection, but for truth. Afterward, women approached me with tearful eyes and tight hugs. One said, "I left last month too." Another whispered, "You gave me courage." And a third, older, maybe in her 60s, took my hand and said, "I wish I had left when I was your age, but tonight I found peace through you." Julian waited until the crowd thinned. When he finally stepped forward, he didn't say anything at first. He just smiled and handed me a mug, tea, warm and familiar. "You were extraordinary," he said. I shook my head. I was terrified. That's how I know it mattered. We stood there a while, not speaking, just being. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not for my scars, but for the way I had stitched myself back together. Not as someone's wife, not just as a mother, but as Sarah, entirely my own. I heard the knock before I saw the car. A slow, hesitant rhythm, like someone unsure whether they should even be there. I opened the front door, and there he was. Ben. His face was thinner. There were more lines around his eyes, but his stance was still the same. Hands shoved in his coat pockets, chin tucked slightly like he was bracing for impact. I didn't say anything at first, just stared. He cleared his throat. "Hey." I raised an eyebrow. "Did you jog here?" He gave a quick, humorless laugh. Guess I deserved that. Silence stretched between us. A gust of wind swept down the porch, making the chimes rattle behind me. I stood my ground. Finally, he spoke again. "I've been meaning to reach out. I just didn't know how." I crossed my arms. "And you thought unannounced was the way to go?" His mouth opened, then closed. He nodded slowly, taking it. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For all of it. For lying. For betraying you. For not being the man you thought I was." I didn't feel the wave of anger I used to expect when imagining this moment. I didn't feel the impulse to scream, cry, or demand answers. What I felt was distance. A gulf of space between the woman I had been when he walked out and the woman I was now. "You were a coward," I said calmly. "You didn't just betray me, Ben. You stole time. You watched me unravel and never reached for me. Not once." He looked down, the weight of my words seeming to settle in his shoulders. "I know," he said, "and I regret it, every day. I thought about writing 100 times, but what do you even say to someone after what I did?" "Nothing," I replied, "because this isn't for you to fix anymore." He looked up, startled. "I'm not asking to fix anything. I just wanted to acknowledge the damage. You didn't deserve what happened." I studied him. For a brief moment, I could still see the man I had once loved, the way he used to laugh with Emily, how he danced with me barefoot in the kitchen, how we whispered future plans under warm covers. But that man was a memory, and the man in front, of me. He was a ghost of choices he made. "I've moved on, Ben," I said, not cruelly but clearly, not to someone else necessarily, but to myself. "I spent so long blaming myself for your choices, but I don't carry that anymore." He nodded, eyes glinting. "I'm glad," he said. "You look like yourself again, stronger." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. After a pause, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It's just a letter for Emily. I wasn't sure if I should give it to her directly. I took it without comment. Then he turned to leave. He paused at the top of the steps. I know it's too late to say this, but thank you for everything you gave. For who you were, I see it now. I watched him walk down the path and back to his car, a part of me feeling like I was watching the final scene in a film that no longer needed a sequel. When the car disappeared down the street, I stepped back inside and closed the door. No. Tears came. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the table where I'd written that letter to myself not long ago. He came back, I wrote in my journal. But not for me, not really, and not because he's changed. He came back because I finally did. I glanced toward Emily's room. The letter from Ben sat on the table. I'd let her decide when or if she wanted to read it. That was the gift I could offer her now, the freedom to choose. Something I never had back then. Something I had now. Fully. Finally. Here is the final installment. The morning sunlight streamed in through the kitchen windows, casting golden pools across the hardwood floor. Emily was still asleep upstairs, the house quiet in a way that didn't ache anymore. It felt like peace now. I sat at the table, journal open, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and smiled at the word I had just written at the top of the page. Reclamation. Not healing, not moving on, not even forgiveness. Reclamation. This wasn't about Ben anymore, or what he did, or didn't do. This was about taking my life back, brick by brick, breath by breath. It had been months since that night at the bookstore, since I stood in front of strangers and cracked open the pieces of myself I had once hidden. Since then, something had shifted, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was choosing, curating, creating. I'd started leading a weekly journaling circle at the local library, just 10 women around a table, notebooks in hand, stories untangling on the page. I didn't have to be a therapist or an expert. I just had to show up, honestly. Some weeks we wrote about grief, others about sex, sometimes about silence and the things we never got to say. It was messy and beautiful, and it felt like mine. Julian and I still met up for coffee, and sometimes walks, and sometimes more. We hadn't labeled it. We didn't need to. What we had was slow, honest, and uncomplicated by the weight of old expectations. One evening, while sitting on a bench watching Emily chase fireflies in the field near the bookstore, he turned to me and said, "You're a little bit magic, you know that?" I laughed. I'm a divorced mom who runs a journal circle and still eats cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. Exactly, he said. That's the magic. I didn't blush. I didn't downplay myself. I just said, thank you. Because I'd finally learned how to receive. There were still echoes of the past, moments where something would trigger an old wound, a song, a scent, an anniversary date, but they no longer held me hostage. I no longer needed to rewrite what had happened. I had stopped obsessing over the question of why he did it and started focusing on what I was building now. I had boundaries. I had joy. I had freedom. One afternoon, Emily asked if we could go to the beach. Just the 2 of us. We drove with the windows down, singing off-key to whatever was on the radio. When we got there, she kicked off her sandals and ran straight into the surf, squealing. I followed slower, feet sinking into warm sand. She turned back and shouted, "Come on, Mom!" And I did. We splashed and laughed and chased each other through the shallows until we collapsed, soaked and breathless, onto the blanket we'd brought. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of coral and lavender, she rested her head on my shoulder and said, "You're happy now, aren't you?" I looked at her, this wise little girl with eyes full of wonder and a heart full of questions. "I am," I said, "but more than that, I'm free." She nodded, like she understood something most adults never do. And I realized The best legacy I could give her wasn't a perfect family or a flawless mother. It was this: a woman who had learned to rebuild, to rise, to choose herself without apology. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep, I wrote my last journal entry in the leather-bound notebook I had bought the day Ben left for that quick jog. Dear me, you didn't break. You bent, you bled, you fell, but you didn't break. You became. And becoming was always the point. I closed the journal, placed it on my shelf, and reached for a new one. A blank slate. Because the rest of the story was mine to write. And this time, I wouldn't hold the pen like it could be taken away. I would press it to the page with intention, with fire, with love, with truth.